These cars should not exist in America, at least not legally on American roads. For decades, some of the world's most extraordinary automobiles were effectively banned from US highways. Multi-million-dollar mechanical masterpieces deemed illegal because they were never certified to meet American regulations. But in 1999, a mysterious change in federal law created a tiny loophole, a provision called show and display that allowed a handful of these forbidden fruits to finally roll on American asphalt. Behind this obscure regulation lies a fascinating story of wealth, influence, clandestine car imports, and the obsessive passion of a small group of collectors determined to possess the unpossessable. The tale includes one of the world's richest men whose frustration over a seized supercar helped reshape federal law. It includes cars smuggled into the country under the cover of night, legendary vehicles trapped in a legal limbo for years, and secret negotiations at the highest levels of government. This is the untold story of how a select few ultra-rare automobiles escaped bureaucratic purgatory, and why this obscure federal exemption exists at all. The problem: America's automotive Iron Curtain. To understand why the show and display rule became necessary, we first need to understand the regulatory wall that stood between American enthusiasts and many of the world's most desirable cars. In 1966, in response to alarming highway fatality rates and Ralph Nader's influential book Unsafe at Any Speed, Congress passed the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act. This landmark legislation empowered the government to set safety standards for all vehicles sold in the United States. Over the following decades, American automotive regulations diverged significantly from those in Europe and Asia. Different crash test requirements, lighting specifications, emission standards, and even bumper heights meant that many foreign vehicles couldn't legally be sold in the US without substantial modifications. In 1970, the Clear Air Act added another layer of complexity, requiring manufacturers to certify that their vehicles met increasingly stringent emission standards. This certification process is expensive and time-consuming, often requiring dozens of test vehicles and millions of dollars in development. For mass-market cars, amortizing these certification costs across hundreds of thousands of vehicles made economic sense. But for limited production supercars or special models intended for only a few hundred customers worldwide, the math simply didn't work out. Some manufacturers created special federalized versions of their exotic cars, often with ungainly modifications that compromised the original design. Others simply decided the US market wasn't worth the trouble. When Porsche unveiled the revolutionary 959 in 1986, a technological tour de force that previewed the future of sports cars, the company built just 337 examples. Converting the complex, twin-turbocharged supercar to meet US regulations would have required sacrificing several precious prototypes for crash testing. Porsche declined to do so, making the 959 forbidden fruit for American customers. The 959 wasn't alone. Dozens of limited production automotive icons remained off-limits to American enthusiasts throughout the 1980s and 1990s. US Customs was vigilant. If you tried to import one of these non-compliant vehicles, the best outcome was that officials would seize the car and force you to export it. The worst? Your million-dollar dream machine might be crushed into a cube of expensive scrap metal. The loophole seekers, gray imports, and clandestine cars. But the human desire has a way of finding paths around prohibitions. As the worldwide collector market heated up in the 1980s and 1990s, the appetite for these forbidden exotics only grew more intense among wealthy American enthusiasts. Some collectors attempted to exploit the temporary importation rules, which allowed foreign vehicles to enter the US for up to 1 year for shows, competitions, or repairs. Others registered their exotic treasures in Canada or Mexico, where many European models were legal, and borrowed them for drives on American roads. A thriving gray market emerged, and with independent companies buying European specification cars, modifying them to meet US regulations, and selling them to American buyers, at its peak in the mid-1980s, this cottage industry imported as many as 60,000 vehicles annually. Automakers were not pleased. Mercedes-Benz, which saw gray market importers undercutting their US dealer prices by as much as 30%, led the charge to crack down on these unauthorized imports. In 1988, the Imported Vehicle Safety Compliance Act slammed the door on most gray market imports. The new law required that modifications to bring vehicles into compliance be formed by the original manufacturer or a registered importer working with the original manufacturer's cooperation, effectively killing the independent import business. Enforcement was serious. In 2013, in a dramatic demonstration of its authority, U.S. Customs and Border Protection publicly crushed several illegally imported Land Rover Defenders. The message was clear: don't mess with import regulations. But for a small group of extraordinarily wealthy and passionate collectors, the forbidden status of certain automotive icons remained intolerable. Among them was one of the world's richest men, whose personal frustration would help catalyze a change in federal law. The Gates factor. When a billionaire can't get what he wants. In 1987, Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates ordered a Porsche 959, at the time the most technologically advanced sports car ever created. With a twin-turbocharged flat-six engine, computer-controlled all-wheel drive, and a top speed of 197 miles per hour, the 959 was a technological marvel that perfectly aligned with Gates' passion for cutting-edge innovation. But when Gates' precious Porsche arrived in the United States, it was promptly impounded by U.S. Customs. Despite his vast wealth and growing influence, Gates found himself powerless against federal regulations. His 959 would sit in customs limbo for 13 years. Gates wasn't alone in his 959 frustration. Fellow tech entrepreneur and race car driver Bruce Canepa also imported a 959 and was determined to find a way to legally drive it on American roads. Canepa began an intensive lobbying effort, spending years researching potential regulatory solutions. Paul Mahler, another frustrated 959 owner and creator of the Mahler Skycar vertical takeoff and landing vehicle, joined the cause. Together with Gates, they began exploring legislative remedies for their shared problem. While Gates had never publicly confirmed his involvement in the lobbying effort that followed, multiple sources in the collector car community have suggested that his influence played a significant role in what happened next. In 1998, a small provision was tucked into a massive Transportation Equity Act for the 21st century. A $217 billion federal bill primarily focused on highway infrastructure and funding. That seemingly minor amendment introduced a new concept into U.S. import law: the show and display exemption. The provision created a narrow exemption to federal import regulations for cars of historical or technological significance produced in limited quantities. Vehicles approved under the show and display could be legally imported and driven on U.S. roads for up to 2,500 miles per year, primarily for exhibition purposes. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration was charged with determining which vehicles qualified. To be eligible, a car needed to be produced in quantities of no more than 500 worldwide and possess exceptional historical or technological significance. In 1999, after a 13-year wait, Bill Gates was finally able to legally register his Porsche 959. The billionaire's persistence and presumably his influence had helped create a pathway for a handful of the world's most significant automobiles to reach American roads. The chosen few. Which cars qualify and why? So which cars actually qualify for this rare exemption? The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration maintains a list of approved vehicles, and the criteria are exceptionally stringent. To qualify, a vehicle must be produced in quantities of 500 or fewer worldwide. It must have historical or technological significance, and it cannot have a substantially similar U.S. certified counterpart. Even then, approval isn't guaranteed. A list of approved vehicles reads like a dream garage of automotive unobtainium. The McLaren F1, of which only 106 were built, the Mercedes-Benz CLK GTR, just limited to 25 examples, the Porsche 959, the Jaguar XJ220, and various limited edition Lamborghinis and Bugattis. Interestingly, the rule isn't limited to super exotics. The Nissan R34 Skyline GTR V-Spec and Midnight Purple 2, of which only 282 were produced, and even certain Volkswagen concept cars have been granted approval. But NHTSA is selective. Many applications are denied because the cars don't meet the strict criteria for historical or technological significance, or because the agency believes the application is an attempt to circumvent normal import restrictions. For instance, while the Porsche-built Mercedes 500e sedan is certainly desirable, it doesn't qualify because it was produced in quantities exceeding 500 and doesn't represent a significant enough technological advancement. The application process itself is involved. Potential importers must submit detailed documentation about the vehicle, including its production history, technological innovations, and historical significance. They must also prove that the specific example they wish to import is authentic and unmodified. Even after approval, there are strict limitations. Cars imported under show and display can only be driven up to 2,500 miles per year and only for purposes related to exhibition or maintenance. The owner must maintain records of the vehicle's mileage and usage and be prepared for potential inspections by federal authorities. Importantly, while show and display requires an exemption from certain safety standards, it doesn't exempt vehicles from emission requirements. Cars newer than 21 years old must still meet EPA standards or be modified. This is where specialists like Bruce Canepa come in. Canepa developed a comprehensive modification program to make the Porsche 959 compliant with California's strict emission standards, a process that costs owners hundreds of thousands of dollars but allows their cars to be legally registered. The controversy: privilege or preservation? The show and display rule has not been without controversy. Critics argue that it represents a perfect example of how the ultra-wealthy can bend laws to their advantage, a loophole literally created for billionaires. Consider the economics. To purchase a vehicle that qualifies for show and display, you typically need to spend well into 7 figures. The McLaren F1, the most numerous car on the approved list, now commands prices exceeding $20 million. The cost to modify these vehicles for emissions compliance can add hundreds of thousands more. This is clearly a regulation that benefits only the financial elite. Safety advocates have also questioned whether allowing these non-compliant vehicles on public roads, even in limited numbers, undermines the integrity of America's vehicle safety standards. Defenders of the rule make a preservation argument. These rare automobiles, they contend, represent significant chapters in automotive history and technological development. Allowing them to be imported, maintained, and occasionally driven helps ensure their preservation for future generations. Unlike paintings or sculptures, automobiles are kinetic art, meant to be experienced in motion. A Ferrari F40 sitting motionless in a museum loses an essential dimension of its significance. The show and display rule allows these mechanical masterpieces to fulfill their intended purpose, albeit in a limited way. Furthermore, advocates argue these cars inspire passion for automotive innovation and preservation when they appear at public events. A generation of engineers and designers have been influenced by encounters with these rare machines. There's also a practical reality. The limited mileage allowed under show and display means these vehicles spend minimal time on public roads, representing a negligible safety risk. Many contemporary supercars that are fully compliant with US regulations have performance capabilities far exceeding these classics. The modern landscape, how the rule functions today. Today, the show and display rule continues to function much as it did when it was established in 1999. NHTSA maintains a list of approved vehicles, and wealthy enthusiasts continue to use the provision to import automotive treasures that would otherwise remain forbidden. The actual number of cars imported under the rule remains small, likely fewer than 100 vehicles in total since its inception. This limited impact helps explain why the loophole has persisted despite its controversial nature. Interestingly, show and display has become somewhat less critical thanks to another provision in the US import law, the 25-year rule, which exempts vehicles 25 years and older from most federal safety standards. As time passes, more of these once forbidden exotics age into this broader exemption. The Porsche 959, the car that helped inspire show and display, is now old enough to be imported under the 25-year rule regardless of its show and display status. The same applies to the Ferrari F40 and many other supercars from the 1980s and early 1990s. However, for newer limited production hypercars, show and display remains the only pathway to legal US importation. Vehicles like certain Pagani models, limited edition Koenigsegg's, and even some special edition Ferraris would be impossible to legally register in the US without this provision. NHTSA periodically updates its list of approved vehicles. Recent additions include the McLaren Senna GTR, limited to 75 examples worldwide, and the Aston Martin Vulcan, of which only 24 were produced. For owners, the responsibilities remain significant. They must maintain detailed records, limit annual mileage to 2,500 miles, and use the vehicles primarily for exhibition purposes. The cars must be maintained in their original configuration, with modifications allowed only for emissions compliance. Wheels of influence. The show and display rule represents a fascinating intersection of wealth, influence, automotive passion, and federal regulation. It stands as perhaps the only federal law created specifically to accommodate the desires of a handful of ultra-wealthy collectors. yet it also serves a legitimate preservation purposes. These extraordinary automobiles, the rarest of the rare, occupy a unique position in our mechanical heritage. They represent pinnacle achievements in engineering, design, and human creativity. Their presence on American roads, even in strictly limited numbers, enriches our collective automotive culture. Does it matter that it took the influence of one of the world's richest men to create this narrow legal pathway? Perhaps, but the same passion that drove Bill Gates to wait 13 years for his Porsche 959 is shared by enthusiasts of all economic means. When a McLaren F1 or a Mercedes CLK GTR appears at a public car show, it draws crowds of admirers who may never be able to afford such machines but can now appreciate their significance. In this way, the show and display rule democratizes access to automotive history, even as its direct benefits flow primarily to the privileged few. The story of the show and display rule reminds us that our legal system is not immune to influence, but also that passion for mechanical excellence transcends economic boundaries. These rolling sculptures, preserved through a particular legal loophole, represent more than just the playthings of the wealthy. They are tangible links to watershed moments in automotive evolution, permitted to fulfill their purpose on American roads through a provision as rare and as exceptional as the machines it was designed to accommodate.